This is Eating Behaviours Revision. It's on paper 3 with issues, debates, forensics and relationships. If we have a look at the advanced information, we need to be aware of explanations for food preferences. So we need to look at the evolutionary explanation and the the role of learning, including social and cultural influences. And then we've got psychological explanations for anorexia and nervosa, so family systems, social learning theory and cognitive theory. And then we've got psychological explanations for obesity, including restraint, disinhibition and the boundary model. And then we've got explanations for the success and failure of dieting. So there's quite a lot of content for this one. So we'll start with explanations for food preferences. So we'll start with the evolutionary explanation. So evolutionary preferences might have provided an adaptive advantage. So those ancestors who had certain preferences would be more likely to survive and reproduce. We have a preference for sweetness. So sweet taste is a reliable signal of high energy food. Steiner placed sugar on the tongues of newborn humans and found positive facial expressions such as an upturned mouth, and this shows that newborns have a preference for sweetness. Fructose is a fast-acting sugar which is present in ripe fruit, and it would have been favoured by our ancestors. Then we have a preference for salt, and Harris has found that babies between the age of 16 and 25 weeks who had been breastfed preferred salted rather than unsalted cereal. Breast milk is low in salt, so it shows that they had not learned a salt preference and that this salt preference was innate. And then we have preference for fats. So high calorie foods such as fats were not readily available to our evolutionary ancestors. So learning to prefer foods which are high in calories would have carried an advantage, because calories provide energy important for survival. So there are our preferences. So we've got sweetness, salt and fat. And then we've got two other aspects here which are a little bit different. So we've got neophobia, which is an unwillingness to eat new or unfamiliar foods, which is strongest between the age of 2 and 6 years. Birch suggests that this is because children begin to explore their environments without their parents. So they're doing this independently, and neophobia is therefore protective because it stops them eating substances that could cause them illness. Then we have taste aversion. So this links to the theory of biological preparedness, which suggests we are more likely to acquire certain taste aversions more quickly than others. So we learn taste aversions which make us less likely to eat food that has gone bad or is toxic. And Garcia did some research where they classically conditioned rats to acquire a taste aversion to sweetened water after pairing it with a poison. So taste aversion is an adaptive advantage which aids our survival, and it can be seen in other animals too. Then finally we have this idea of bitter tastes. So these are a reliable warning sign of toxins or that a food has gone off, and being able to detect bitter taste would be helpful to survival. And Steiner found negative facial expressions in newborns in response to bitter tastes, showing that they hadn't learned these preferences, but there's an innate mechanism to make them dislike bitter tastes. So in evaluation of this, we have strengths. So we've got research support where they reviewed studies into the link between stress and eating behaviour and found that humans have an increased tendency to prefer high-fat foods during periods of stress when fight or flight is initiated. So we have greater demands for energy during this period of time and an increased fat preference during times of stress could be helpful to our survival. Then we have a limitation. So neophobia might not be adaptive in the modern food environment because food is safer these days. So it actually restricts a child's intake of food that could provide nutritional benefits. And we have a final limitation. So we would expect all people to share the same adaptive food preferences, but they don't. So, for example, with regards to the bitter tasting chemical, which is associated with foods that are dangerous, some individuals have found that people differ in their ability to detect this chemical, and we wouldn't expect that if it was adaptive. We'd expect everybody to be able to detect this chemical, but some individuals cannot. So that's the evolutionary explanation for food preference. And now we'll have a look at learning theory and food preference. So we have quite a few different ideas in this one. So we have classical conditioning, which is flavour learning. So we develop a preference for a new food because of its association with a flavour we already like. So an example of this is by sweetening your porridge with jam. That association eventually leads to you liking the new food on its own. Then we have operant conditioning, where food preferences are reinforced. So, for example, you get a reward for eating certain foods in the form of encouragement or praise, or you might be punished for not eating a food. So you might get punished for not eating your vegetables, for example. And then we have social learning theory, where children acquire their food preferences from role models. So if they see a role model being rewarded or showing enjoyment when they're eating a food, then they identify, and if they identify with that person, they're more likely to imitate that behaviour. And it has an adaptive function because it ensures that children eat foods which are obviously safe. Family influences, so parents are gatekeepers and their preferences affect the foods that their children have access to. Peer influences. Birch conducted a study with children. Each child was sat next to a different child who preferred a different vegetable. So, for example, if you like carrots, you were sat next to someone who liked peas. And then after 4 days, then you would change your preference from carrots to peas or vice versa, because you would observe the other children. And they compared these individuals to a control group, and these preferences were evident after several weeks. Then you have media influences. So models outside the family can affect food preferences. So television advertising, for example, adverts are often linked to fun characters for unhealthy foods, and these can cause preferences to occur. Then you have cultural influences, so we learn about cultural rules with regards to eating around the dinner table, so what we should eat and how much we should eat, and this is linked to cultural norms. So, for example, the older generation had a cultural norm of meat and 2 veg, so that links to this idea of us having a Sunday roast, which is a very cultural thing in the UK. And this links to learning. So we associate many of the foods that we eat as adults with feelings of security and happy experiences. And they might be linked to enjoyable cultural occasions and specific cultural food choices. So, for example, feasts, or, for example, we like the taste of cake because we associate cakes with birthdays and celebrations. Vicarious reinforcement links to this too, because culture influences which foods are given to children, and children see their cultural group enjoying these foods. So in evaluation of learning and food preferences, we have a limitation, so there's not very much evidence for the role of classical conditioning. So we have a study here where they asked student participants to taste previously untried flavours, And in the experimental condition, they paired them with a sweet taste, and there was no difference between this group and a control group who had a neutral flavour. So it suggests that classical conditioning and flavour learning isn't a complete explanation for food preferences. Then we have a strength. So there's research to support the role of social learning in food preferences. So Jansen and Tenney gave children either an energy dense or an energy dilute yogurt drink that they'd never tasted before, and the most preferred taste was the energy dense drink taken at the same time as a teacher who was also having the drink and praised the drink and showed signs of enjoyment. So that's that vicarious learning there. So they identified with the teacher, they saw them as a model, and therefore they imitated their behaviour. So it supports this idea of social learning, modelling and vicarious reinforcement. And another strength, so there's evidence that cultural factors influence food preferences, and this can be seen in cultural changes. So for example, there's been an increase in fast food restaurants, and this has led to a greater preference for foods of this type that can be consumed quickly, that have high fat, salt, sugar, and children have a preference for these foods. So people are eating more fatty, salty, sugary foods, and this links to the cultural changes, so we can see the influence that culture has on our food preferences. Okay, so that's explanations for food preferences. So make sure you're aware of the evolutionary explanation, neophobia and taste aversion specifically because they're named in this advanced information, and the role of learning in food preferences, including social and cultural influences. So the social influences are like your social learning, your parents and your peers, and then your cultural influences links to your cultural norms. Now we'll look at psychological explanations for anorexia. So we've got family systems theory, social learning theory and cognitive theory. So family systems theory, I have 4 key features. So you have enmeshment, which is over-involvement with each other. There's a lack of boundaries. There's a lack of leadership. Family members spend a lot of time together. They impinge on each other's privacy. So the anorexic daughter wants to assert her independence and differentiate her identity from everyone else. I have overprotectiveness. So family members nurture each other obsessively in a way that reinforces family loyalty and leaves no room for independence. Rigidity. Interactions are inflexible. Members deny the need for change and work hard to maintain things as they are, and they're too rigid to adapt, so they're thrown into crisis when change happens. Conflict avoidance. The anorexic family avoid conflict or suppress it, and there's no discussion of issues where there's a difference of opinion. So these issues are underlying, they fester, and then a crisis develops. Then we have the idea of autonomy and control. So anorexia is caused by the adolescent daughter's struggle to achieve autonomy and control, which she craves. The mother is domineering, intrusive, doesn't accept her daughter's need for independence, and this causes a distorted body image and an inability to identify internal body states such as hunger, and an overwhelming feeling of a loss of control. This leads to self-starvation, and self-starvation is important because it's a way of the individual gaining control and showing their independence, and because self-starvation leads to weight loss, the weight loss is a visible measure of success. So the thinner she gets, the greater her degree of control. In evaluation, we have strength. So research support, Strauss and Ryan compared women diagnosed with anorexia nervosa with healthy controls, and they found that they had greater disturbances of autonomy, more controlling, and a rigid style of regulating their behaviour. They differentiated less clearly between themselves and other family members, which shows enmeshment, and they perceived poorer communication within their families. So it shows this idea of a desire for autonomy and this idea of enmeshment being a risk factor. Then we have another strength. So there's evidence that therapies based on family systems theory have had some success. So behavioural family systems therapy attempts to disentangle family relationships. It encourages a person with anorexia nervosa to interact more with people outside the family circle and reduce parental control over eating. And then the effectiveness has been tested, and it's found that when the treatment lasts 16 months at the end, 6 of the participants from 11 were considered recovered, and another 3 recovered 1 year afterwards. So it shows that this family systems theory is a good way of us developing treatment, and the treatment that links to this is successful. Then we have limitation. So links between family interaction and anorexia nervosa depend on other factors, such as mediating factors. So Davis found that family interactions affected eating disorders only in adolescence with high levels of anxiety. Other studies have shown that family factors have no significant effect on eating disorders when there's no depression or peer influences. So anxiety, depression, peer influences may be mediating factors in anorexia nervosa, which also link to the family systems theory too. So it's not family systems theory on its own. That's not a complete explanation of anorexia nervosa, because there's other factors that can influence it too.
Okay, so we'll continue with the social learning theory for anorexia. So first of all, we've got the idea of modelling. So it can be acquired indirectly through observation of a model. The model can exist in real life, such as a family member, or they can be symbolic, so for example a character on television. Models are influential because they modify social norms by establishing what is acceptable or usual behaviour in a situation. So for example, a child observing an older sibling constantly restricting her food intake may learn that this behaviour is normal. Models are influential. If a person identifies with them, they may respect them or perceive them as successful, glamorous, and associate the model's thinness with these desirable characteristics. So that all links into the role of the media, which is coming up next. So all this idea of modelling and the vicarious reinforcement links in with the role of the media. So vicarious reinforcement. The likelihood of imitation depends on observing the positive or negative consequences of the behaviour. So if the model is rewarded, for example by being praised for losing weight, then this makes the imitation more likely. Role of the media. The media is a source of symbolic models and forms cultural ideals about body shape and size. The ideal has become thinner, and size 0 is often presented as a body shape for young women to aspire to. Young women may identify with female celebrities and fashion models who conform to thin ideals. This might motivate them to behave in ways whereby they lose weight and then wanting to achieve thinness, so they might diet and exercise. And the behaviour would be vicariously reinforced by the rewarding fame, success, wealth, respect and satisfaction they observe in the female role models in the media. Then we have social learning theory research here. So we've got Dittmar, who had 162 British girls aged 5 to 8 years of age, and this was about Barbie and her image and how that impacted them. So they were all exposed to images either of Barbie dolls, MA dolls, which have a more realistic body type, or control images of flowers, balloons and clothes. The girls were asked to rate statements about body esteem, such as "I'm pretty happy with the way I look," to the and the extent of their body shape dissatisfaction was assessed by them colouring in 2 body silhouettes, One they thought represented their body shape, and another the one that they wanted to be. They found that the girls who saw the Barbie images were significantly more dissatisfied with their body shape and had lower body self-esteem than the girls who saw the MA or control images. So the research concluded that the Barbie doll is a powerful role model for young girls because of the glamour associated with her, and they internalised the thin ideals. So this was done in 2006, and I know that Barbie have actually brought out lots of different size dolls now, so that might be something to make a point of, that they've actually changed that now as a response to things like these studies. So strength, support from a natural experiment in Fiji. So Becker et al. Investigated the effects of the introduction of TV broadcasts on eating attitudes and behaviours. They looked at 63 adolescent females who completed a questionnaire, and in 1995 when the TV broadcast began, and again they had 65 girls 3 years later do the same questionnaire, and they found that in 1995 13% of the girls gained a high score on the questionnaire, indicating an eating disorder risk. And in 1998 it was 29%, so they've seen an increase there, and it could be that they've been influenced by female body shape ideals through the introduction of television and media. Social learning theory can explain cultural changes in anorexia nervosa. For example, in Japan, there have been increased rates of anorexia nervosa over the past 40 years, and this could be due to the change in cultural norms and cultural ideals in this area. So, for example, in Japan, women who regularly read magazines see this thin ideal, and it could be that there's a link there with the change in media. Then we have a limitation. So social learning theory has not led to effective therapies for anorexia nervosa. Presenting models of healthy eating or body shape to someone with anorexia could be a useful accompaniment to a therapy. For example, the therapy that we just looked at, family systems therapy, might be more effective, but you might want to combine it with some aspects of social learning theory. There might also be better alternative explanations, such as a neural explanation, and drug therapies could be used, or cognitive therapies, which we'll look at next. So you can counteract social learning theory with cognitive or with family systems theory if you want, just to say that they might be more effective treatment methods. Social learning theory doesn't necessarily give us a treatment method, but we can take things from social learning theory. For example, within the media you have the body positivity movement now, where we're shifting away from this thin ideal body shape, and there's things like models now have to be a certain weight or BMI for them to be on the catwalk. They have to have a healthy BMI to be on the catwalk. So things like this are changing due to the research into social learning theory and the impact that it has on body shape ideals. Okay, so next we have got cognitive theory. So this is the final psychological theory for anorexia nervosa. So this is linked to cognitive distortions about body shape and weight. The first factor is disturbed perceptions. So these are preoccupations with thoughts of food, weight and body shape. People with anorexia nervosa become more and more critical of their own bodies. They misinterpret their emotional states as feeling fat, even as they get thinner. And research suggests that people with anorexia nervosa consistently overestimate their body weight and size. So Williamson et al. Did a study with 37 participants who had anorexia nervosa diagnosed. They used the body image assessment to estimate their current body size and indicate their ideal size. These participants were less accurate in their size estimates when compared to a control group of people with no eating disorders. So the anorexia nervosa group showed a tendency to overestimate their size, and their ideal body shape was significantly thinner than it was for the controls. So this research supports this idea that they have disturbed perceptions, inaccurate perceptions of their own body image. The second factor is irrational beliefs. So people with anorexia nervosa often express irrational beliefs and attitudes about their disorder. One example is all or nothing thinking. If I'm not thin, I'm fat. If I don't control my own weight, I am worthless. Another is catastrophizing. I ate half a biscuit today, I've got no willpower at all. And a final irrational belief is perfectionism. And this is the view that the individual has to meet their most demanding standards all the time, and failure to do so is judged severely. Perfectionism is usually accompanied by intensive record keeping to make sure the individual is achieving their harsh goals. So an individual who shows perfectionism will set really, really high goals for themselves, goals that are almost unachievable. And even if they did meet their goal, they would then set a second goal that would be even harder than the one that they'd first set themselves. Then we have cognitive inflexibility. So people with anorexia nervosa may lack cognitive flexibility. So Treasure and Schmidt proposed a cognitive interpersonal maintenance model, which suggests that people with anorexia nervosa experience problems with set shifting. So they find it difficult to switch from one task to another task, which requires a different set of cognitive skills. So when they get started on the weight loss process, they rigidly persist with it and continue to perceive themselves as needing to lose weight, and they find it hard to switch to a more healthy way of thinking about their body shape and size. So this could link into the treatments that we'll look at in a second, that we've just mentioned previously as an alternative to that. So it's just this idea that once they stick with something, they can perceive it in a different way and they have to continue with that. They find it really difficult to switch to doing something else or switch to doing something that requires a different set of cognitive skills. So now we'll have a look at the evaluation. So we have a strength. So there's research to support the role of disturbed perceptions. So we've got some research which scanned the brains of participants with anorexia nervosa and controls, and they found that the individuals with anorexia nervosa, although the same brain areas were activated when they were shown non-self images, when they were shown images of themselves, those with anorexia nervosa showed very little activation in the parts of their brain which were linked to attention, and it was not true of the controls. So it's this idea that the lack of attention might form a cognitive distortion because they're not reacting normally to an image of their body, which links this idea of disturbed perceptions. They can't see themselves accurately. Then we have another strength, which is research support for perfectionism. So this was a study with 728 women over the age of 16, all diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, so it's quite a large sample size. They assessed their symptoms using a questionnaire, and they also had to complete a second questionnaire which measured indicators of perfectionism, and they found that childhood perfectionism was associated with current anorexia nervosa symptoms. So there was a link between perfectionism within childhood and the symptoms that they were showing. whilst they were diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. So it shows that perfectionism could be an indicator for this eating disorder. Finally, we have a limitation. So we have some research that challenges cognitive theory. So within this research, they compared body images of 30 women with anorexia nervosa and 137 women without. And they used a morphing task where the participants had to adjust a computerized image of themselves until it matched their estimated body size. It then calculated the BMI of the manipulated image, and they found there was no significant difference between the groups of women, between their estimated and actual BMIs. So it suggests that people with anorexia nervosa do not have a distorted body image, and because the distortion was similar in the control group also. Okay, so that's all of our psychological theories of anorexia nervosa. So make sure you're aware family systems theory, key parts including enmeshment, autonomy and control. So they're keywords that are mentioned in this advanced information, so make sure you can define these keywords and give examples to support them. Social learning theory, including modelling, reinforcement and the media. Cognitive theory, including distortions and irrational beliefs. So all of these keywords that are mentioned in the advanced information, make sure you can explain these and define them. Okay, so let's have a look at the final part, which is psychological explanations for obesity. Let's have a look at this. Okay, so we've got restraint theory, which is the first psychological explanation for obesity. So this is the idea that attempting to lose weight involves restrained eating, which is self-defeating, and it can lead to people overeating, which leads potentially to obesity. So restrained eaters set strict limits on their food intake. They categorise foods into good and bad and create rules about which foods are allowed and which are forbidden. This control is cognitive because they have to consciously think about their weight and eating a lot of the time. Because of this, it can lead to a paradoxical outcome. So because they put limits on what and how much to eat, the restrained eater no longer eats when they're hungry and stops eating when they're full. Their eating behaviour is not physiological anymore, it's cognitive. And because it is cognitive, it can lead to disinhibition of eating behaviour. So this is where periods of restrained eating are followed by disinhibited eating, where the individual eats as much as they want. Restrained eaters are vulnerable to internal and external food-related cues. So if they have fluctuations in their mood, if they smell food, if they see images of food, these cues are called disinhibitors, and they can lead to a loss of control over restrained eating and even a binge. It's kind of like if you're dieting and then you pass a cake shop and you know that you can't have cakes but you smell them, it's like, oh well, I'll just go get a little one, and then you'll go in and you'll buy several cakes and you'll just eat them all. So that's a disinhibition, and that's the paradoxical outcome. So it's something that's restrained eating is supposed to help you, but actually it makes it worse. When you would binge like that, it can lead to all or nothing thinking. So if you, for example, eat a slice of cake, then you think, well, I've blown my diet today, I'll just continue to eat whatever I want and I'll start my diet again tomorrow. This all links into the boundary model. So the boundary model is where food intake exists on a continuum. So we have hungry at one side, and then you have satiety at the other, where you feel full. And when your energy levels dip below a set point, then you feel hungry and you start to eat. That creates fullness. like you've all done this with your neural explanations of eating behaviour, and then eventually you're motivated to stop eating, and then you reach satiety. And that's all linked to your hormones, like leptin and ghrelin. Restrained eaters have a lower hunger boundary, so they're less responsive to feelings of hunger. They also have a higher satiety boundary, so they need more food before they feel full. And this could be because they've previously overate before they've gone on a diet. They have self-imposed their upper boundary, so they've actually set a cognitive boundary as to how much they can eat, like the maximum that they can eat, and this boundary is often before the boundary of satiety. So when they break this cognitive boundary, they will continue to eat even past that satiety boundary, and that's an example of disinhibition. So I'm sure if you can find a diagram of that as well in the textbook if you want to visualise that boundary model. So then we have evaluation of psychological explanations for obesity. So we've got research support from Wardle and Beals, where they randomly allocated 27 obese women to 3 groups. One group followed a restrained eating diet for 7 weeks. The other group followed an exercise regime but didn't restrain their eating. And the third group received no treatment of any kind. The restrained eaters consumed significantly more calories than the other participants because even though they tended to eat less throughout the 7-week period, they occasionally experienced disinhibition when they would eat beyond feeling full. So this suggests that restraint leads to disinhibition, and this can eventually lead to overeating, which leads to weight gain, which leads to obesity. Another strength, we've got support for the role of food-related cues in disinhibition. So the disinhibition model claims that restrained eaters are vulnerable to food-related cues such as those from the media. And we have a study here where the participants were shown images of thinness, so models advertising beauty products. Other participants saw neutral images such as furniture. And then what they did was they measured the participants' food intake through a taste test, and they were allowed to eat as much as they liked from snacks. They found that restrained eaters ate significantly more than unrestrained eaters after being shown media images of thinness, but there wasn't an impact for neutral images. So it shows that food-related cues, or anything that's linked to weight really, can act as a disinhibitor, and they can trigger overeating and obesity. And then we have a limitation. So restraint is more complex than the boundary model indicates. Researchers have identified at least 2 different forms of restraint. One is rigid, which is all or nothing approach to limiting food intake, and the other is flexible, which allows a restrained eater to eat limited amounts of some forbidden foods without necessarily triggering disinhibition. So I'd say like an example of that flexible restraint might be if you're on a Slimming World diet or Weight Watchers diet, where they have like chocolate bars that you can have, or like I feel like, is it Slimming World, where you have like a number of sins that you're allowed, and you can save them up and you can use them to have like that piece of cake or something that you really want anyway. So it's restraint, but it's flexible, and it allows you to eat these forbidden foods so that disinhibition doesn't affect you as much. So the boundary model is limited as an explanation because it fails to consider the true complexity of restraint. It also doesn't explain why some people can lose weight through restraint, for example, individuals who are suffering from anorexia nervosa. Okay, right, so that's your psychological explanations for obesity. So you've got restraint theory, disinhibition, and the boundary model, but you've also got to talk about the explanations for the success and failure of dieting, which we'll look at now. With regards to the success of dieting, there has been one exam question previously which it's like got an item and you have to suggest strategies for successful dieting for the individual in the item. So I've took this from the mark scheme because I think this might be helpful. So from the mark scheme, it said, so strategies for successful dieting. We've got cognitive therapy, which might help as if it emphasises the positive rewards of dieting. You've got group-based social and practical support, so joining organised groups such as Weight Watchers or Slimming World. Interventions combining group therapy, health advice and exercise have been shown to produce moderate but sustained weight loss. Moderating aims, so trying not to use 1 kilogram every week, increases the chances of sustained success. And taking an interest in preparing food and organising a varied, healthy diet can help restrained eaters see dieting as very positive. So there's just a few things there that link to successful dieting, and these are things that I picked up off the mark scheme for that question. So it might be worth just picking a few out of there and making a note of them. So then we've got the next parts are linked to the failure of dieting, so why diets fail. First of all, here we've got the spiral model. So this is the idea that dieting behaviour is a chain of linked events. So dieting begins when you experience body dissatisfaction. First time dieters experience some success because they temporarily lose weight. Lasting weight loss is rare, so they might regain that weight and the diet might fail. Most dieters stick to the plan, but next time they eat even less, and this is more of a restriction, which has physical and psychological effects. The dieter experiences more frustration and emotional distress, which makes them more vulnerable to disinhibited eating. Metabolic processes in the body change, so weight loss becomes physically more difficult to achieve. The result is further failure followed by repeated attempts to diet harder and a lowering of self-esteem, an increase in depression. And then it states that the individual is now trapped in a destructive downward spiral in which weight loss is less and less likely. So you can see this through individuals who may go through periods of yo-yo dieting. So they'll go on a diet, they'll lose a lot of weight really, really fast. Then they'll gradually regain the weight, and then next time they'll go on an even harsher diet and restrain themselves even more. But because your body's changing and your metabolism's changing as you're losing that weight, it becomes more difficult, and then you get trapped in that yo-yo dieting spiral. Then we have ironic processes theory. So this is the idea that when you're asked not to think about something, you're more likely to think about it. So with regards to dieting, if you say certain foods are not allowed or certain foods are forbidden, you try and suppress their thoughts, but actually it leads to disinhibition because you think about them more and you excessively intake that food, which leads to dieting failure. So it's like, don't think about chocolate, you're not allowed any chocolate today, and then all you can think about all day is chocolate. And then you have some and you just eat a lot of it because you know that you're not supposed to have it. Then you have disinhibition and dieting. So this again links to the previous point. So it links to the success and failure of dieting. So diets place limits on food intake, but when you restrain your eating, you become more vulnerable to internal and external food-related cues. The spiral model links to this and shows that continuous restraint can lead to emotional frustration. And ironic processes theory also links to this because you're constantly reminded of the food that you're trying to suppress. And this means that you think about the food more than usual, which leads to disinhibition. The dieter loses control and overeats, so they may not lose weight. And and they may actually gain weight. So all of those things link together really. And if we think about those ideas for success of dieting, they link into it as well. So this idea of the social and practical support could help individuals who are suffering emotionally whilst they're going through that dieting process. This idea of the interventions with group therapy and health advice, they give people a more realistic idea of what a good diet looks like and what a healthy diet is. So they have moderate but sustained weight loss, so they don't go through this spiral whereby they lose a lot of weight and then they regain it slowly. So, we'll just look at the evaluation for dieting. So we've got a strength. So the spiral model suggests how dieting can become successful. So it identifies several points where the individual can break out of the spiral. So Hetherington and Poliv say that people who diet to lose weight have low self-esteem, but it's not people of true who restrain their eating to avoid putting on weight. Their self-esteem is higher. It's a low self-esteem that leads to disinhibited eating. So preventing low self-esteem can avoid diet failure. So that could be like that group support. It could be that healthy advice of what a healthy body looks like, what it is to be healthy. It could be those type of things which are interventions that could help. Group therapy is something that could help here as well. So the best way to diet successfully is to promote self-esteem and ending attempts to lose weight, and accepting yourself as you are, and just maybe not trying to lose weight but maybe try to eat a little bit healthier. Strength. There's evidence for the role of ironic processes. So in a study, they took students who were trying to cut down on their intake of unhealthy snacks. They were presented with a diet intentions expressed in a negative form. So when I'm sad, I will not eat chocolate. And after they were exposed to these statements, they kept a snack diary during the following week, and they found a rebound effect. So they actually ate unhealthy snacks more often and consumed more calories than a control group if they'd seen these negative statements. So it's just this idea that if you're told that you can't have something, you think about it more, and by thinking about it more, it means that it becomes more attractive to you, and then you're more likely to consume it. And then finally, we have a limitation. So theories do not account for individual differences. Ogden suggests that these theories do not explain why some people succeed in weight loss, even when they're preoccupied with food. So, for example, people with anorexia nervosa. One explanation is locus of control. So internals believe that weight loss is contingent for their own efforts and they have control, so they might be more successful with their diets, whereas externals believe they don't have control, so they're less likely to succeed. So the explanations for failure of dieting, they're not complete, and it could actually link to other theories such as locus of control. So if we have a look at that advanced information, so psychological explanations for obesity, including restraint theory, disinhibition and the boundary model, and then explanations for the success and failure of dieting. But you can link restraint theory to the success and failure of dieting, and disinhibition too. Okay, right, so that's all of eating behaviours for you.